Sometimes the most unlikely heroes find us when we need them most. Sometimes salvation comes on 4 paws, carrying hope in a worn black bag. Up in Crooked Hollow, hermit Amos Trigg hadn't spoken to another soul in 4 long winters. Then a soaked golden pup appeared at his cabin, carrying a mysterious satchel. Inside, Amos found old letters, a faded photograph, and a crude map leading deep into the valley. A young girl was missing, and this faithful dog had been searching for someone to help. What followed was a journey that would change everything. But could a man who'd lost his way truly guide others home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin perched on the mountainside like a weathered hawk's nest, built from timber that had aged to the color of storm clouds. Amos Trigg sat on his porch, needle and thread, working through the worn leather of his boots, with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. The morning mist clung to the valley below, and the only sounds were the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling the thermals. 4 winters had passed since Amos last heard a human voice that wasn't his own echo bouncing off canyon walls. 4 winters since he'd walked away from everything he'd once been, carrying nothing but guilt and the ghosts of his failures. The isolation suited him fine. Up here, among the granite peaks and endless sky, there was no one left to disappoint. The golden retriever appeared like a vision from the mist, stumbling through the brush with the determination of something driven by purpose beyond its understanding. Water dripped from its matted coat and mud caked its paws. But what caught Amos's attention wasn't the dog's bedraggled state. It was the black leather satchel clamped firmly between its teeth. The dog stopped at the edge of the clearing, amber eyes fixed on Amos with an intelligence that made the old hermit's hands pause in their work. No collar marked the animal as belonging to anyone, but something in its gaze spoke of loyalty, of mission, of desperate hope. "Well now," Amos murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. "What have we here?" The dog approached slowly, each step deliberate, never breaking eye contact. When it reached the porch steps, it sat with formal precision and gently placed the satchel at Amos's feet. Then it waited, tail thumping once against the weathered boards, a single hopeful beat. Amos set down his needlework and studied the bag. The leather was quality once, hand-tooled with care, but years had worn it soft and supple. Brass buckles had tarnished green, and the strap showed tooth marks where the dog had carried it. With careful hands, he lifted the satchel and worked the clasp open. The first thing he pulled out made his breath catch in his throat. A photograph, its edges soft with age and handling, showed a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. Eleanor. Even after all these years, seeing her face was like taking a fist to the chest. But this wasn't his photograph. He'd burned all of those in a fit of self-loathing 3 winters back. This was different, newer somehow, though the woman was unmistakably her. Beneath the photograph lay a bundle of letters tied with string, and under those, something that made Amos's hands tremble. A crude map scratched onto what looked like deer hide, showing landmarks he recognized. The twin peaks called Devil's Horns, the switchback trail down to Willow Creek, and deeper in the valley, a spot marked with an X. The dog whimpered softly, drawing Amos's attention back to those intelligent eyes. Whatever had driven this animal to find him, whatever desperate mission had brought it through miles of wilderness to his door, it wasn't finished yet. With shaking fingers, Amos untied the string around the letters. The paper was common stock, the kind sold at Morrison's General Store down in Pine Ridge, but the handwriting was educated, careful. The first letter was dated 3 weeks ago. "Please," it began, "if anyone finds this, our daughter Sarah is missing. She left camp 5 days ago and hasn't returned. We've searched everywhere we can think of. She's 12 years old, blonde hair, wearing a blue dress, and her grandmother's locket. Please help us find her. We're camped at Widow's Point until the snow comes." The Hendricks family. Amos read the letter twice, then picked up the next one. Same handwriting, same desperate tone, but dated a week later. The family had expanded their search, found signs of their daughter deeper in the valley, tracks leading toward the old mining country where few people ventured. They were running out of time, out of hope. The third letter was different. The handwriting was shakier, as if written in haste or fear. Sarah's trail leads to the abandoned culver mine. We can't follow. Men with guns turned us back. They said she wasn't there, but we know they're lying. We're heading back to Pine Ridge for help, but winter's coming fast. If someone finds these letters, please, she's all we have left. The map will show you where to look. God bless anyone who tries to help our little girl. Amos looked up at the dog, understanding flooding through him like cold mountain water. This animal hadn't just wandered up to his cabin by chance. It had been searching, carrying this burden across miles of wilderness, looking for someone, anyone, who might help. You've been at this a while, haven't you, boy? Amos said softly. The dog's tail wagged once, recognition of the first kind words it had heard in who knew how long, but it was the photograph that held Amos transfixed. Eleanor's face, unchanged by the years that had aged him into a ghost of himself. He turned it over and found writing in a different hand, younger, more flowing. Aunt Eleanor, I wish you were here to help me understand Uncle Amos's stories. I know you loved him, even if he doesn't think so anymore. I hope someday I get to meet him and tell him that. Love, Sarah. The words hit Amos like a physical blow. He stared at the photograph, then at the letters, pieces of a puzzle falling into place with terrible clarity. Eleanor had a niece named Sarah, Eleanor, who had died in his arms 4 years ago while he was too slow, too late. Too useless to save her from the bullets meant for him. The dog sensed his distress and moved closer, pressing its warm body against Amos's legs. For the first time in 4 years, the hermit felt something other than the familiar ache of guilt and self-recrimination. He felt the stirring of purpose, distant and fragile as a candle flame in mountain wind. Eleanor was gone, had been gone for 4 long years. But her niece was out there somewhere, lost in country that could kill the unwary in a dozen different ways. And somehow, this loyal dog had found the one man who might know these mountains well enough to bring her home. Amos had been sheriff of Pine Ridge County for 15 years before Eleanor died. He'd tracked lost hunters, found missing children, brought order to a wild corner of the territory. But that was before his failure to protect the one person who mattered most had driven him to exile himself in these peaks. The dog whimpered again, a sound that spoke of urgency and dwindling hope. Amos looked at the map, recognizing every landmark, every trail marker. The culver mine was 3 days' hard travel through terrain that would test a mountain man's skills. In late autumn, with winter weather closing in, it was treacherous country even for someone who knew it well. But looking at Eleanor's photograph, at her gentle eyes and trusting smile, Amos felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 4 winters. Maybe he couldn't save Eleanor. Maybe he'd carry that failure to his grave. But her niece was still out there, still waiting for someone to care enough to try. "All right, boy," he said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. The animal leaned into his touch with pathetic gratitude. "I reckon we've got ourselves a job to do." The dog's tail began wagging in earnest, and for the first time in 4 years, Amos Trigg began planning for something other than another day of solitude. He studied the map again, committing the route to memory, calculating distances and elevation changes. The culver mine was old country, honeycomb with shafts and tunnels surrounded by box canyons that could trap the unwary. If armed men were using it as a hideout, they'd have picked it for good reason. As the afternoon wore on, Amos found himself talking to the dog. First just muttered observations about the weather and the trail conditions, then longer conversations about the country they'd be crossing and the challenges they'd face. The animal listened with focused attention, head cocked, amber eyes never leaving Amos's face. "You're not just any dog, are you?" Amos mused as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. "You've got too much sense, too much determination. Someone trained you, loved you, trusted you with something important." The dog padded over to where Amos had set the photograph and gently picked it up in its mouth, carrying it back to him. The gesture was so deliberate, so purposeful, that Amos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You knew her, didn't you?" he whispered. "Eleanor?" Somehow you knew her. As if in answer, the dog sat down beside him and rested its head on his knee, a gesture of comfort that Amos hadn't experienced in 4 long years. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine Eleanor's hand in this unlikely messenger's arrival, to believe that maybe, just maybe, the woman he'd failed in life was giving him one last chance to do something right. The setting sun painted the peaks gold and crimson, and somewhere in the valley below, a child was waiting for rescue. Amos Trigg, hermit and former lawman, began to plan his return to the world of the living. Dawn came cold and grey, with the promise of weather building over the western ridges. Amos had spent a restless night sorting through gear he hadn't touched in years, oil-stained hands, checking rifle actions, and testing the weight of his pack. The dog, he'd taken to calling it Scout in his mind, had stayed close, watching every preparation with the intensity of a creature that understood the gravity of what lay ahead. The decision to leave his mountain sanctuary hadn't come easy. 4 years of self-imposed exile had built walls around his heart that felt as solid as the granite peaks surrounding his cabin. But Eleanor's photograph, propped against his coffee cup on the rough-hewn table, seemed to watch him with those gentle eyes that had always seen more good in him than he deserved. "Time to go." "Scout," Amos said, shouldering his pack. The weight felt familiar despite the years. 30 pounds of survival gear, medical supplies, and the tools of a manhunter. His father's Winchester rode easy in the leather scabbard. Cleaned and loaded for whatever they might face in the country ahead, Scout bounded to his feet, tail wagging with an enthusiasm that seemed to chase away some of the morning gloom. The dog had spent the night on the porch, positioned where he could watch both the trail and the cabin door, a sentry keeping faith with a mission that had driven him across miles of wilderness. They struck out before full daylight, following the old deer path that wound down from Amos's Ridge toward the main valley. The descent was steep but familiar, carved into the mountainside by generations of wildlife seeking water and easier ground. Scout ranged ahead, nose to the trail, then circled back to check on Amos with the precision of a trained companion. "You've done this before," Amos observed, watching the dog's methodical approach to the terrain. "Someone taught you to work with a partner." The hand-drawn map had been etched with surprising accuracy, showing landmarks and trail junctions that matched Amos's knowledge of the country. Whoever had created it understood this wilderness, knew the hidden paths and secret ways that didn't appear on any government survey. The X marking their destination lay 2 days' travel southeast, in country that grew more dangerous with every mile. By mid-morning they'd reached Willow Creek, running high and fast with autumn snowmelt from the peaks above. The crossing required careful footing on moss-slick stones, but Scout proved as sure-footed as any mountain goat, bounding from rock to rock with the confidence of long practice. On the far bank, Amos found the first sign that their mission was more than just a wild chase through empty wilderness. Bootprints in the soft earth beside the water, too large and too fresh to belong to the missing girl. Someone else was moving through this country. Someone with enough woodcraft to stay hidden, but not enough to avoid leaving occasional traces. 3 men, maybe 4, Amos murmured, studying the tracks with eyes that remembered how to read the subtle language of bent grass and disturbed soil. Moving fast, but not trying too hard to hide their trail. That could be carelessness, or it could be confidence. Scout sniffed at the tracks, hackles rising slightly as some scent caught his attention. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not fear, but recognition of something that didn't belong in this peaceful valley. The trail continued southeast, following the creek for several miles, before turning up a side canyon that Amos knew led toward the old mining district. The going got rougher as they climbed, switchbacking up slopes covered with loose shale and deadfall timber. This was country that tested both man and beast. where a single misstep could mean a broken leg and slow death. But it was also country where a 12-year-old girl might hide, might survive if she had the woodcraft and the will to keep going. Amos found himself hoping that Eleanor's blood ran strong in her niece, that the same courage and determination that had made Eleanor the finest woman he'd ever known might keep Sarah alive in this harsh wilderness. The first real test came at Eagle's Nest Pass, a narrow gap between towering cliffs where the wind howled like something alive and angry. Scout pressed close to Amos's legs as they negotiated the treacherous footing, both of them leaning into gusts that could easily knock a man from the trail. On the far side of the pass, Amos called a halt to study the map more carefully. They were making good time, but the country ahead was unfamiliar territory, mining claims and abandoned camps scattered through valleys he hadn't visited since his sheriff days. The X on the map still lay a full day's travel away through terrain that would only get more challenging. "We'll make camp at Prospect Point," he told Scout, who seemed to understand every word. "Give us good cover and a view of the approaches. If there's trouble ahead, I'd rather see it coming." But as they prepared to move out, Scout suddenly stiffened, ears pricked toward the valley they'd just left. The dog's body language spoke of alert tension, the kind that came from detecting something that didn't belong. Amos followed his gaze and saw nothing but empty wilderness, but he'd learned to trust the superior senses of animals that had kept him alive during his years as a lawman. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, dropping to one knee beside the dog. Scout's growl was barely audible, a vibration felt rather than heard. Then Amos saw it, a flash of movement on the trail they'd just traveled, too distant to make out details but definitely human. Someone was following them, moving with the careful stealth of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. The realization sent cold fingers walking down Amos's spine. They were no longer just searching for a missing girl. They were walking into something that had teeth, something that had noticed their presence and decided to take an interest. The boot prints by the creek weren't random travelers. They belonged to men who guarded their territory and didn't welcome visitors. "Change of plans," Amos murmured, studying the terrain ahead with new urgency. "We're going to have to be a lot more careful from here on out." Scout's amber eyes met his, and Amos saw intelligence there that went beyond ordinary animal instinct. This dog had survived in country that killed the careless, had carried his burden across miles of wilderness without giving up hope. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers waited in the shadow of the Culver mine, they would face it together. The bond forming between man and dog felt as natural as breathing, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. For the first time in 4 years, Amos wasn't alone in the wilderness. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he had something beyond his own guilt and regret to keep him moving forward. They pushed on toward Prospect Point as the afternoon light began to fade, both of them aware that they were no longer just searchers, but the searched. Somewhere behind them, unknown eyes were watching, unknown hands were following their trail. The game had begun in earnest, and the stakes were higher than just one lost girl. They were walking into the kind of trouble that had ended his career as sheriff, the kind that had cost Eleanor her life. But this time, Amos vowed as he checked the action on his rifle, this time he wouldn't be too late. Prospect Point lived up to its name, offering a commanding view of 3 valleys and the network of game trails that connected them. Amos chose a sheltered spot among the boulders where a small fire wouldn't be visible from below, and where Scout could keep watch while maintaining cover. The dog had proven remarkably adept at reading the terrain, choosing paths that offered concealment while still allowing them to make good time. As twilight settled over the mountains, Amos studied the map by firelight, comparing the crude markings to his mental catalogue of the country ahead. The X that marked their destination lay in a box canyon beyond the ruins of the old Mackenzie claim, territory he remembered as treacherous, even in good weather. With winter closing in and unknown hostiles in the area, it would test every skill he'd learned in 15 years of law enforcement. Scout lay beside the fire, head on his paws, but ears alert to every sound that drifted up from the valleys below. The dog's presence had already changed something fundamental in Amos's approach to the wilderness. For 4 years he'd moved through these mountains like a ghost, avoiding all contact with the living world. Now he found himself planning not just for his own survival, but for the welfare of a companion who had trusted him with a mission that mattered. "You're good company," Amos said quietly, scratching behind Scout's ears. "It's been a long time since I had anyone to talk to who didn't talk back with my own voice." The dog's tail thumped once against the rocky ground, but his attention remained focused on the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Something about Scout's alertness reminded Amos of the best deputies he'd worked with, men who understood that survival often depended on what you noticed before it noticed you. Dawn brought the discovery that changed everything. Following the map's guidance, they descended into Cedar Draw, a narrow valley carved by centuries of snowmelt and seasonal flooding. The creek ran clear and cold, bordered by stands of aspen that had turned autumn gold. It should have been peaceful country, the kind of place where a man could forget his troubles and lose himself in the simple rhythm of walking. Instead, Amos found signs of violence. The campsite was tucked into a grove of cottonwoods, hidden from casual observation, but positioned with a clear view of anyone approaching from either direction. Whoever had chosen this spot understood fieldcraft, knew how to balance concealment with tactical advantage. But something had gone wrong here, something that left scattered gear and signs of struggle among the fallen leaves. "Easy, Scout," Amos murmured as the dog's hackles rose. The scent of old fear still lingered here, along with something else that made Scout circle the camp with nervous energy. Amos read the signs, with eyes trained by years of investigating scenes where violence had visited quiet places. A tent had been hastily abandoned, personal belongings scattered in the panic of sudden departure. Bootprints in the soft earth told a story of pursuit and capture, of someone small and desperate trying to escape larger, heavier pursuers. Then Scout found it, half hidden beneath a pile of leaves near the creek bank. A small golden locket on a delicate chain, the kind a loving family might give to a 12-year-old girl. Amos picked it up with careful hands, feeling the weight of worked gold and the warmth it still seemed to hold despite the cold mountain air. Inside the locket was a photograph, a family portrait showing parents and a blonde girl with serious eyes and a shy smile. On the reverse, engraved in careful script, Sarah Margaret Hendricks, "Beloved daughter." "This is her," Amos said softly, showing the locket to Scout. "This is the girl we're looking for." The dog sniffed at the locket, then began casting about the campsite with renewed purpose. His nose led him to a spot near the water's edge where the soft earth held clear impressions, small bootprints heading upstream, moving fast but not in panic. Sarah had escaped the initial capture, had gotten away from whoever had surprised her camp, but the larger prints followed, at least 3 sets of them, tracking her with the methodical persistence of professional manhunters. The trail led deeper into the canyon, toward country that grew more wild and dangerous with every mile. Amos studied the locket again, focusing on the girl's face. Eleanor's eyes looked back at him, the same gentle intelligence that had seen through his rough sheriff's exterior to the man he wanted to be. Sarah was family, connected to the woman who had loved him despite his failures, despite the darkness that seemed to follow in his wake. "She's got her aunt's courage," he told Scout, tucking the locket carefully into his shirt pocket. "Running upstream, staying in the water to throw off the scent. Smart girl, thinking like someone who spent time in wild country." The discovery of the locket made the mission personal in a way that went beyond duty or conscience. This wasn't just about helping a stranger in trouble. This was about family, about the connections that bound people together across distance and time. Eleanor was gone, but her blood lived on in this brave girl who was fighting for her life in country that could kill the unwary. They followed the creek upstream, Scout ranging ahead to check for sign, while Amos read the subtle story written in disturbed gravel and bent grass. Sarah had been clever, using the water to mask her trail, but she was young and probably frightened. Her pursuers were experienced, patient, willing to take the time necessary to run their quarry to ground. The trail led them deeper into the canyon, where the walls rose steep and forbidding on either side. This was country that could become a trap, where a wrong turn might lead to a dead end with no way out. Amos felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came when a situation was sliding toward violence. When all the careful planning in the world might not be enough to prevent bloodshed, Scout suddenly froze. One paw raised, nose testing the wind that funneled down the canyon. His body language spoke of immediate danger, of something ahead that didn't belong in this wilderness sanctuary. Amos dropped to one knee, rifle ready, scanning the canyon walls for movement. Then he heard it, the distant sound of voices carried on the mountain air, too far away to make out words, but close enough to confirm that they were no longer alone in this remote place. Men's voices, harsh and commanding, the kind that spoke of authority backed by violence. "Easy, boy," Amos whispered, his hand finding Scout's head. "We're getting close now. Oh, time to be extra careful." The dog pressed against his leg, offering the comfort of warm companionship in a place that suddenly felt heavy with menace. Somewhere ahead, Sarah was depending on them to find her before her captors lost patience with whatever game they were playing. Time was running out, and the country ahead offered a dozen ways for things to go terribly wrong. But looking down at Scout's trusting amber eyes, feeling the weight of Sarah's locket over his heart, Amos knew he would see this through to whatever end awaited them in the shadow of the mountains. The voices faded as quickly as they had come, swallowed by the vast silence of the canyon country. Amos and Scout moved forward with the careful stealth of hunters who had become the hunted, every step calculated to avoid the loose stones that might betray their presence. The afternoon sun slanted low between the canyon walls, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that could hide a dozen threats. Sarah's trail continued upstream, but the sign was growing fainter. Her captors had either caught up with her, or she had found some way to throw them off the scent. Either possibility filled Amos with a mixture of hope and dread that made his hands shake as he checked. His rifle for the dozenth time that day, Scout led them to a narrow side canyon that branched off from the main watercourse, barely wide enough for a man to pass without scraping his shoulders on the stone walls. The opening was so well concealed that Amos might have walked past it without a second glance. But the dog's nose had found something that drew him toward the hidden passage. "Good boy," Amos whispered, running his hand along Scout's flank. The dog's breathing was steady despite the hard traveling, his coat thick enough to turn the mountain cold that was already beginning to bite as the sun sank toward the western peaks. The side canyon opened into a natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone, its walls rising in terraced layers toward a sky that had turned the color of old pewter. At the far end, partially hidden by a tumble of boulders, Amos spotted the dark mouth of a cave. Scout's body language told him they'd found something important. The dog's tail was up. His ears pricked forward with focused attention. The cave mouth was larger than it appeared from a distance, carved by water and time into a shelter that could house several people in relative comfort. Someone had been using it recently. The remains of a small fire ring marked the entrance, and gear was cached in the shadows beyond the reach of wind and weather. More importantly, Sarah had been here. Amos found pages torn from what looked like a journal, covered with a young girl's careful handwriting. The paper was good quality, the kind that well-off families might give to a daughter for recording her thoughts and experiences. Scout sniffed at the pages with interest, his tail wagging as he recognized a familiar scent. Amos picked up one of the journal pages and read by the fading light, "Day 3 in the mountains. The men came to our camp just before dawn. I heard Papa shouting, then gunshots, then nothing. I ran like Papa taught me, stayed in the water like he said, but they're following. Found this cave yesterday. There's old mining gear here, probably from the gold rush days. I can hear them calling for me sometimes, but they haven't found this place yet. Water tastes good from the spring in the back. Food running low. Wish Scout was here. He always knew when strangers were coming. The words hit Amos like a physical blow. Sarah's parents were dead, murdered by the men who were hunting her through these canyons. This wasn't a simple kidnapping for ransom. This was something far more sinister, something that had turned a family camping trip into a nightmare of blood and pursuit. "Scout," he said quietly, and the dog came to his side immediately. "You belonged to her, didn't you?" "You were her dog." Scout's response was a soft whine, a sound full of loss and longing that spoke of separation from someone deeply loved. The pieces were falling into place now. The dog's determination to find help, his knowledge of the country, his uncanny ability to follow Sarah's trail. He hadn't just stumbled across the letters in the black satchel. Someone had given them to him, trusted him with a mission that might be the girl's only hope of survival. Amos found more journal pages scattered around the cave, each one revealing more of Sarah's desperate situation. She was smart, resourceful, using skills her father had taught her to stay alive in country that could kill the unwary. But she was also 12 years old, alone, and running out of time as winter closed in and her food supplies dwindled. Day 5. They found my first hiding place. Had to run again. Moving toward the old mine country, like Papa said, but it's getting colder and the snow's starting. Scout, if you're out there, if you got away like I hope you did, find Uncle Amos. Mama always said he was the best tracker in 3 counties. Tell him I'm Eleanor's niece. Tell him I need help. The final entry was barely legible, written in haste or fear. They're close now. Can hear them talking about what they'll do when they catch me, moving deeper into the mine tunnels. If something happens to me, I want everyone to know that Scout is the bravest dog in the world. He tried to protect us. Tell Uncle Amos that Aunt Eleanor loved him, even at the end. She made me promise to find him if anything ever happened. Amos sat back on his heels, Eleanor's wedding ring heavy on the chain around his neck. He'd worn it there since the day she died, a constant reminder of his failure to protect the woman he loved. Now her niece was in the same kind of danger, hunted by killers who had already murdered her family. But this time would be different. This time he wouldn't be caught off guard, wouldn't be too slow or too late. Scout had brought him this chance for redemption, this opportunity to honor Eleanor's memory by saving what was left of her family. The dog seemed to sense his thoughts, moving closer and resting his head against Amos's knee. The simple gesture of comfort and trust broke something loose in the old hermit's chest, a warmth that he hadn't felt since Eleanor's death. For 4 years, he'd believed himself unworthy of love or loyalty, but Scout's faith in him suggested otherwise. "We're going to find her," Amos promised, his voice rough with emotion. "We're going to bring her home safe." Scout's tail wagged once, a gesture of absolute confidence that made Amos smile for the first time in longer than he could remember. Outside the cave, full darkness was falling over the canyon country, and the temperature was dropping toward the killing cold of a mountain night. But inside the shelter, man and dog planned their next move with the quiet determination of those who had found something worth fighting for. The hunt was far from over. But the hunters had become the hunted, and somewhere in the maze of tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the old mining district, a brave girl was waiting for rescue. The morning broke grey and bitter, with snow dusting the canyon rims like powdered sugar on a baker's shelf. Amos woke to find Scout pressed against his side, sharing warmth in the cave that had sheltered them through a night that dropped well below freezing. The dog's breathing created small puffs of vapor in the cold air, but his amber eyes were alert and ready for whatever the day might bring. Amos pulled his father's sheriff badge from the bottom of his pack, where it had rested unused for 4 years. The metal was tarnished black, the eagle and star design barely visible beneath layers of neglect. He'd carried it out of habit more than hope, unable to throw away the last symbol of the man he'd once been. Now, holding it in the pale morning light, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like an old coat that still fit despite the years. Sarah was counting on him to be more than just a broken hermit hiding from his failures. She needed the lawman he'd once been, The tracker who could read sign like scripture and follow a trail through country that would swallow lesser men. "Time to earn this again," he murmured, pinning the badge inside his coat where it wouldn't catch the light. Scout watched the ceremony with grave attention, as if he understood the significance of the moment. They left the cave as the first rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls gold and crimson. The map showed the Culver mine was still a hard day's travel through increasingly dangerous terrain, but Sarah's journal entries suggested she was moving in that direction, following some plan her father had taught her. The country began to change as they climbed toward the mining district. Ancient tailings piles marked the locations of played-out claims, and rusted machinery lay scattered among the rocks like the bones of some mechanical graveyard. This was the high country now, where winter came early and stayed late, where a single storm could trap the unwary until spring. Scout's nose led them to more signs of Sarah's passage, a scrap of blue fabric caught on a thorn bush, boot prints in a patch of mud beside a spring. She was still ahead of them, still moving, but the signs were getting fresher. They were gaining on her, but so were her pursuers. The first real test of Amos's returning skills came at Devil's Backbone, a narrow ridge that connected two peaks across a chasm that dropped away into shadow. The old sheriff's instincts kicked in as he studied the approach, reading the terrain with eyes that remembered how desperate men thought. How they chose their ground when violence was inevitable. "They're watching this place," he told Scout, pointing to a tumble of boulders that commanded a perfect view of the ridge. "Any smart man would post a lookout here. Question is, are they smart men or just lucky ones?" Scout's hackles rose as he tested the wind, and Amos got his answer. Someone was up there, someone whose scent carried the taint of violence and unwashed bodies. The dog's body language spoke of immediate danger, of predators waiting in ambush for prey to walk into their trap. Amos felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had warned him of trouble during his years as sheriff. It was the same feeling he'd had the day Eleanor died, the same electric tension that preceded gunfire and bloodshed. But this time, he wasn't walking into an ambush blind. This time, he had Scout's superior senses and 4 years of mountain living to give him an edge. They worked around the obvious approach, using a game trail that switchbacked up the north face of the ridge through cover that would hide them from watchers above. It was slow going, dangerous in places where loose rock could send them tumbling into the void, but it kept them invisible to anyone watching the main trail. The detour took most of the morning, but it brought them to the far side of Devil's Backbone without raising an alarm. From their new position, Amos could see the watchers his instincts had warned him about, 2 men with rifles, positioned exactly where he'd expected them, covering the approach any lawman would be forced to take. "Professional," he murmured, studying them through the crude telescope he'd carried in his pack for 4 years without using. They know their business, but they're thinking like men who expect opposition to come straight at them. The sight of armed killers made the badge inside his coat feel heavier, more real. These weren't random bandits or desperate men driven to crime by circumstance. They moved with the confidence of those who had killed before and expected to kill again. Sarah was being hunted by predators who viewed her as nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. Scout's low growl drew his attention to movement on the main trail below. A third man was approaching the watcher's position, moving with the easy confidence of someone who owned this country. Even at distance, Amos could see the authority in his bearing, the way the other men deferred to his presence when he reached their position. The leader, for that's clearly what he was, spoke briefly with the sentries, then pointed toward the deeper canyon country where the mine tunnels honeycombed the mountainside. His gestures were economical, purposeful, those of a man accustomed to command and instant obedience. Amos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He'd seen that kind of authority before, during his years wearing the badge. It belonged to men who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, who had embraced violence as a tool and learned to use it with surgical precision. "We're not just tracking kidnappers," he told Scout quietly. "We're dealing with something a lot more dangerous than I thought." The dog pressed against his leg, offering comfort and solidarity in the face of odds that were growing longer with every discovery. But Scout's presence also reminded Amos that he wasn't facing this alone. The loyal animal had already proven his worth as both tracker and companion, and there was intelligence in those amber eyes that suggested capabilities beyond ordinary canine instinct. They waited until the leader moved on, and the sentries settled back into their watch routine. Then Amos led the way deeper into the mining country, following Sarah's trail toward a confrontation that would test everything he'd learned in 15 years of law enforcement. The badge inside his coat seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, a metallic reminder of oaths taken and promises made. He'd failed to protect Eleanor, had let the woman he loved die while he was too slow to matter. But Sarah was still alive, still fighting, still waiting for someone to care enough to risk everything for a stranger's child. This time would be different. This time he would be fast enough, smart enough, brave enough to matter when it counted most. The entrance to the old mining district lay hidden in a fold of the mountain, where ancient glaciers had carved a natural amphitheater from living rock. Scattered among the boulder fields were the skeletal remains of headframes and processing mills, their wooden bones bleached grey by decades of mountain weather. But it was what Scout found among the ruins that stopped Amos cold. Pages from Sarah's Bible lay scattered across the rocky ground like fallen leaves, torn from the binding and weighted down with stones. But these weren't random acts of destruction. Each page had been placed deliberately, creating a trail that led deeper into the maze of abandoned tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the mountainside. Amos picked up the first page with careful hands, recognizing the fine paper and gold-edged binding of a family Bible, the kind passed down through generations of faithful folk. The page contained verses from Psalms, and in the margins, written in Sarah's careful script, were words that made his throat tighten with emotion. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not be afraid. Scout is with me always, and Uncle Amos will come when Scout finds him." Aunt Eleanor promised. Scout whined softly as he sniffed at the page, recognizing a scent that spoke of someone he loved, someone who trusted him with missions that mattered more than his own safety. The dog's devotion to the missing girl was absolute, unwavering despite the dangers that surrounded them on all sides. "She's been marking a trail," Amos said quietly, following the line of Bible pages toward a tunnel entrance that disappeared into the mountain's heart. Smart girl, using what she has to leave sign for anyone who might be following. Each page told part of Sarah's story, revealed through the verses she'd chosen and the prayers she'd written in the margins. Page after page spoke of faith tested by fear, of a young girl clinging to belief while killers hunted her through country that could swallow a person whole. Day 8. They found the cave where I was hiding. Had to run deeper into the tunnels. "It's cold down here, and I can't make fires because the smoke might give me away. Found this old Bible in a miner's cabin. Papa always said God looks after those who look after themselves, so I'm leaving these pages for Scout to follow. He'll bring help. I know he will." The handwriting grew shakier on the later pages, betraying exhaustion and fear that no 12-year-old should have to endure. But the faith remained strong, unshaken by circumstances that would have broken many adults. Sarah believed in Scout's mission, believed that somewhere in the vast wilderness, help was coming. Day 10. "Heard them talking about me last night. They think I know something about Papa's business, something worth killing for. But I don't know anything except that Papa loved Mama and me, and that we were just camping because Mama wanted to see the fall colors one last time before she got too sick to travel." The words hit Amos like a punch to the chest. Sarah's mother was dying, probably had been dying when the family set out on what was meant to be a final adventure together. Instead of peaceful memories, they'd found violence and death, leaving a sick woman and an innocent girl at the mercy of killers who saw them as loose ends to be eliminated. Scout's behavior changed as they followed the trail deeper into the mining complex. His movements became more careful, more controlled, as if he sensed they were entering territory where one wrong step could bring disaster. The tunnels here were old, carved by men who understood the mountain's moods but hadn't always been careful about their engineering. Cave-ins blocked some passages completely, while others showed signs of recent excavation. Someone had been working these tunnels, and not for gold or silver. The fresh tool marks and modern equipment scattered through the workings spoke of activities that had nothing to do with historical mining claims. "This is what they're protecting," Amos murmured, studying a cache of supplies that had been carefully hidden behind false rock walls. "Whatever they're doing here, it's worth killing to keep secret." The Bible pages led them deeper, past chambers where modern machinery hummed with purpose, past storerooms filled with crates that bore no identifying marks, but plenty of warnings about handling. This wasn't just a hideout, it was an operation, something that required the kind of security that came from eliminating witnesses. Sarah's final Bible page was pinned to a support timber near what looked like the main tunnel entrance, held in place by a nail driven deep into the wood. The verse was from Revelations, and the margin note was barely legible, written by someone whose strength was failing. Day 12. "Can't run anymore. Too tired, too cold. They'll find me soon, but I'm not afraid. Scout got away, and he'll find Uncle Amos like Aunt Eleanor said he would. Tell them I tried to be brave. Tell them I never stopped believing." Scout pressed against Amos's legs, offering what comfort he could, while the old lawman struggled with emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Sarah was Eleanor's blood, carrying the same courage and faith that had made Eleanor special. But courage wasn't always enough, and faith couldn't stop bullets or turn back men who had embraced evil as a way of life. "She's still alive," Amos said firmly, as much to convince himself as to reassure Scout. If they'd killed her, they would have stopped hunting. They need her alive for some reason, and that gives us a chance. But the chance was slipping away with every hour that passed. The Bible pages were days old, and Sarah's trail was growing cold. Winter was closing in with the promise of storms that could trap them all in these tunnels until spring. And somewhere in the maze of passages ahead, killers were waiting with guns and patience and the absolute certainty that they owned this mountain. Amos touched the badge inside his coat, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with the star and eagle. He'd worn it for 15 years, had sworn oaths that meant something even when the world seemed determined to test them beyond all reason. "Time to go to work," he told Scout, checking his rifle one final time. "Time to be the man Eleanor thought I was." The dog's tail wagged once, a gesture of absolute confidence that made Amos smile despite the odds they faced. Together, they disappeared into the tunnel system that would test everything they had learned about courage, loyalty, and the price of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The tunnel system stretched deeper into the mountain than Amos had expected, carved by generations of miners who had followed veins of ore wherever they led. Some passages were wide enough for equipment and ore cars, while others narrowed to barely shoulder width, forcing them to move single file through darkness that seemed to swallow their lamplight. Scout led the way, with the confidence of an animal who had traveled these tunnels before, his nose guiding them through intersections where wrong turns could lead to dead ends or worse. The dog's familiarity with the underground maze was just one more piece of evidence that his connection to Sarah went deeper than simple loyalty. They found the chamber where Sarah had been, hiding in what had once been a mining supervisor's office, carved from solid rock and reinforced with timber that had seasoned to the hardness of iron. Someone had made it livable, a sleeping area with blankets and supplies, a small camp stove that could be used without betraying light or smoke to searchers above. But it was what Amos found, among Sarah's few possessions, that stopped him dead in his tracks. An envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax, that bore the impression of Eleanor's signet ring. His name was written across the front in Eleanor's careful handwriting, and underneath in different ink, to be opened only by Amos Trigg. From his loving Eleanor. His hands shook as he broke the seal, afraid of what he might find. afraid of words from beyond the grave that might contain blame or accusations he couldn't bear to hear. But Eleanor's letter, dated just days before her death, contained something he'd never expected. "My dearest Amos," it began, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened and I am gone. But I need you to know that I never blamed you for what happened. Never saw you as anything less than the good man I fell in love with all those years ago." Scout whined softly as Amos sank to his knees, the letter trembling in his hands. 4 years of guilt and self-recrimination had built walls around his heart. But Eleanor's words were tearing them down with gentle precision. "I know you will blame yourself, because that is who you are. A man who takes responsibility for everything and everyone, who carries burdens that aren't his to bear. But my death, if it comes, will not be your failure. Evil exists in this world, and sometimes it touches the innocent, despite the best efforts of good men to prevent it." The next paragraph made Amos's breath catch in his throat. "I have a favor to ask of you, my love. My brother William's daughter, Sarah, will need someone to watch over her when I'm gone. Her mother is sick and William has gotten involved with dangerous people. If something happens to them, promise me you'll look after her. She's a special child, Amos, brave and smart and kind, everything you and I would have wanted in a daughter of our own." Amos looked up at Scout, understanding flooding through him like cold mountain water. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew all along." The dog's amber eyes held depths of intelligence that went beyond ordinary animal awareness. Scout hadn't just stumbled across the letters in the black satchel. He'd been carrying Eleanor's final gift, her last attempt to give Amos something worth living for. "Sarah doesn't know about you yet," the letter continued, "but I've told her stories about the brave sheriff who tried to save her Aunt Eleanor, who loved her enough to risk everything. I've planted seeds, Amos, hoping that someday she might need to find you." The final paragraph was blurred by tears that Amos didn't remember shedding. "I trained Scout to find you, if the worst happened. He knows your scent, knows the way to your cabin, knows that you are the one person in this world who would move heaven and earth to protect what's left of my family. Take care of them both, my love. Take care of yourself. You are worthy of love, worthy of redemption, worthy of the second chance I'm trying to give you. With all my love, always and forever, Eleanor." A photograph fell from the envelope as Amos read, not the faded image he'd seen in the satchel, but a clear, recent picture showing Eleanor with a blonde girl who had her aunt's gentle eyes and determined chin. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, "Sarah and me at her 12th birthday. She reminds me so much of you, Amos. Stubborn and brave, and absolutely determined to do what's right, no matter the cost." Scout padded over to where Amos knelt and gently took the photograph in his mouth, carrying it back to him with the same careful precision he'd shown with the satchel. The gesture was so deliberate, so purposeful, that Amos felt the last of his defenses crumble. "You're not just any dog," he said softly, reaching out to scratch behind Scout's ears. "You're Eleanor's final gift to me, aren't you? Her way of making sure I didn't spend the rest of my life hiding from the world." The sound of voices echoing through the tunnel system interrupted his revelations. Men were moving through the passages, calling to each other with the confidence of those who owned this underground domain. They were close now, close enough that their words carried clearly through the stone corridors. "Found more of those Bible pages," a voice called. "Little brats getting sloppy, leaving too much sign." "Good," came the reply from someone with authority in his voice. "Let her get careless. We'll have her by morning, and then we can wrap this whole mess up. What about the man who's been tracking her?" Martinez saw fresh sign topside. "One mountain man against 6 of us? Let him come. We'll bury him next to the rest of the family and be done with it." Amos felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. The same ice-water calm that had seen him through gunfights and manhunts during his years as sheriff. These men had murdered Sarah's parents, were hunting a 12-year-old girl through tunnels that could become her tomb, and spoke of killing him with the casual indifference of men who viewed human life as an inconvenience. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with a broken hermit, a man who'd lost his edge during 4 years of self-imposed exile. They had no idea that Eleanor's letter had just reminded him who he really was. Scout sensed the change in him, the transformation from grieving man to focused predator. The dog's own posture shifted, becoming more alert, more dangerous, as if he too remembered what they were capable of when working together. "They want to play hunter and hunted," Amos murmured, checking his rifle with movements made automatic by years of practice. Time to show them what that really means. He folded Eleanor's letter carefully and tucked it inside his coat next to the badge he wore over his heart. Sarah was more than just a stranger in need. She was family. The daughter Eleanor had wanted them to have, the second chance at protection and redemption that he'd thought was lost forever. The voices were getting closer, and soon the hunters would become the hunted. But first, Amos had to find Sarah, had to make sure Eleanor's niece was safe before he turned his attention to the men who'd made the mistake of threatening his family. Scout's tail wagged once, a gesture of absolute confidence in the man he'd been trained to find. Together, they disappeared deeper into the tunnel system, following a trail that led toward a reckoning 4 years in the making. The deeper tunnels of the Culver mine stretched into the mountain's heart like the chambers of some vast stone cathedral. Here, where the original miners had followed the richest veins of ore, the passages opened into natural caverns carved by underground rivers that had flowed before men ever set foot in these mountains. The air was different here, thinner, colder, carrying sounds and scents from distant chambers where anything might be. Hiding, Amos moved through this underground maze with the methodical precision of a manhunter who understood that patience often meant the difference between life and death. Scout ranged ahead, his nose reading stories written in scent that human senses could never detect, leading them through intersections where wrong turns could mean wandering lost until their lamp oil ran out. In a natural chamber that opened like a cathedral nave beneath the mountain, Amos found what he'd been looking for. His father's rifle, the same Winchester that had served 3 generations of lawmen in his family, felt solid and reassuring in his hands as he began the final preparations for what lay ahead. The rifle was more than just a weapon. It was a connection to men who had stood for justice when justice was scarce, who had faced down evil with nothing but courage and the determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. His grandfather had carried it during the Indian Wars, his father during the range conflicts that had shaped the territory, and now it fell to Amos to honor that legacy in these dark tunnels beneath the earth. He cleaned the action with oil from a small bottle he'd carried for 4 years without using, checking each mechanism with the thoroughness of a man who knew his life might depend on flawless function. The brass cartridges slid into the magazine with metallic precision, each one a promise that he would not go gentle into whatever darkness waited ahead. Scout watched these preparations with the focused attention of a creature that understood the gravity of their situation. The dog's amber eyes reflected the lamplight like twin flames, and his body language spoke of readiness for whatever role he might be called upon to play in the confrontation to come. The sound of voices echoing through the tunnel system had grown more frequent as the day wore on, evidence that Sarah's pursuers were tightening their net around whatever refuge she'd found in the deepest parts of the mine. Their words carried confidence and casual cruelty, the kind that came from men who had killed before and expected no more challenge than they might face from a wounded animal. But Amos had spent the afternoon doing more than just preparing his weapons. Years of sheriff work had taught him to read terrain like scripture, to understand how geography could be turned into advantage by those who knew how to use it. The mine tunnels were a maze, but they were a maze with patterns, and patterns could be learned by men with patience and intelligence. He'd found the central hub where all the main tunnels converged, a vast chamber, where the original miners had built their underground headquarters, complete with workshops, storage areas, and sleeping quarters for men who sometimes spent weeks below ground. It was here that Sarah's captors had established their base of operations, And it was here that any rescue attempt would have to focus. More importantly, Amos had found Sarah herself. The girl was being held in what had once been the mine superintendent's office, a stone chamber carved from living rock and sealed with a heavy wooden door that showed recent modifications. Through a crack in the stone wall, he could see her sitting on a narrow cot, still wearing the blue dress mentioned in her parents' letters. Still alive, despite everything that had been done to her family. She was thin, clearly hungry, but her posture spoke of unbroken spirit. Even as a prisoner, even facing men who had murdered her parents in cold blood, Sarah Hendricks sat with the kind of quiet dignity that reminded Amos painfully of Eleanor. The family resemblance was unmistakable, not just in the shape of her face or the color of her hair, but in the way she held herself, the way she faced fear without surrendering to it. Scout had recognized her scent immediately, his tail wagging with barely contained excitement at being so close to the girl he'd traveled hundreds of miles to help. The dog's joy was infectious, a reminder that not everything in this dark place was touched by evil and violence, but the joy was tempered by the reality of their situation. 6 armed men controlled the main chamber, and they moved with the confidence of professionals who understood their business. Amos had counted them during his reconnaissance, noting their weapons, their positions, their habits. These weren't random killers or desperate men driven to crime by circumstance. They were soldiers, probably deserters from one army or another, who had found more profitable employment in the shadows of civilization. Their leader was a man Amos recognized from wanted posters that had crossed his desk during his years as sheriff. Jake Morrison, formerly Sergeant Morrison of the Union Army, cashiered for brutality during the Indian campaigns and wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder. He commanded his men with military precision, posting guards, organizing patrols, maintaining discipline even in this remote hideout. It was Morrison's voice that Amos heard most often echoing through the tunnels, giving orders with the casual authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. But there was something else in that voice now, a note of concern that hadn't been there before, a suggestion that even Morrison was beginning to worry about the mountain man, who'd been tracking them through country where tracking should have been impossible. Double the watch on the main tunnel. Morrison's voice carried clearly through the stone passages.
I don't like the way this feels.
Mountain man's been too quiet, and quiet men are usually the dangerous ones. Amos smiled grimly at the assessment. Morrison was right to be worried. The broken hermit who'd fled to the mountains 4 years ago might not have posed much threat, but Eleanor's letter had awakened something that had been sleeping in the depths of his soul. The lawman was back, and he was planning something that would give Morrison considerably more to worry about. The plan forming in Amos's mind was both simple and dangerous, relying on his intimate knowledge of the tunnel system and Morrison's overconfidence in his tactical position. The killers controlled the main chamber, but they were thinking like soldiers defending a position, not like miners who understood that mountains had their own rules and their own ways of dealing with those who violated them. Scout would be crucial to the plan's success. The dog's intelligence and loyalty had already proven themselves beyond doubt. But what Amos was contemplating would require the kind of partnership that existed between creatures who trusted each other absolutely. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or misunderstanding, and both man and dog would join Sarah's parents in whatever grave Morrison had chosen for his victims. But looking at Scout's amber eyes, seeing the absolute confidence the dog placed in him, Amos felt the last of his doubts fade away. Eleanor had trained this remarkable animal to find him, to bring him this chance at redemption, to remind him that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. He checked his father's rifle one final time, made sure his ammunition was secure and easily accessible, then began the careful process of moving into position for what would either be Sarah's rescue or their mutual destruction. The badge inside his coat felt warm against his chest. a metallic reminder of oaths taken and promises that still mattered, even in this place where civilization seemed as distant as the stars. Scout pressed against his leg, offering what comfort he could while they waited for the right moment to begin their assault on Morrison's stronghold. The dog's breathing was steady, controlled, that of a creature ready to follow his partner into whatever hell might be waiting in the chambers ahead. Somewhere in the darkness, a 12-year-old girl sat waiting for rescue, trusting in a faith that had sustained her through the worst experience of her young life. She believed that Scout had found help, believed that Uncle Amos was coming, believed that good men still existed in a world that had shown her mostly evil. It was time to prove that her faith was justified. The rescue began in the hour before dawn, when the human body was at its lowest ebb and even hardened killers dozed at their posts. Amos had spent the dark hours moving through the tunnel system like a ghost, Scout beside him, both of them silent as death itself as they took their positions for what would either be salvation or disaster. From his hiding spot behind a support timber in the main chamber, Amos could see Sarah through the crack in her prison wall. She was awake, sitting on the edge of her cot, with the patient stillness of someone who had learned to endure. In the dim lamplight that filtered through her door, he could see her lips moving in what looked like silent prayer, her hands clasped together with the faith that had sustained her through the darkest days of her young life. Tucked beneath her thin pillow was a folded piece of paper that made Amos's breath catch in his throat, a child's drawing done in pencil on paper torn from her journal. It showed a golden dog and a tall man with a star on his chest, standing together beneath mountains that touched the sky. At the bottom, in Sarah's careful script, were the words, "Scout and Uncle Amos come to save me." The drawing was more than just a child's hopeful imagination. It was a testament to faith that had never wavered, even in the face of murder and terror. Sarah had drawn her rescue before it happened, had seen in her mind's eye exactly what Amos and Scout were about to attempt in the darkness of the underground chamber. Morrison's men were deployed exactly as Amos had expected, thinking like soldiers defending a perimeter rather than miners who understood that mountains could be allies to those who knew their secrets. 2 guards at the main tunnel entrance, 1 at the equipment tunnel, another watching the approach to Sarah's prison, and Morrison himself in the command post he'd established in the old superintendent's office. It was the 6th man who worried Amos, a sentry posted in the shadows near the main support pillars, positioned where he could see most of the chamber but remain hidden from casual observation. This one was smart, professional, the kind of killer who survived by being more careful than his companions. Scout had found him during their reconnaissance, the dog's superior senses detecting the man's presence where Amos's eyes had seen only darkness. It was another reminder of how valuable the animal had become, how perfectly Eleanor had chosen her final gift to the man she'd loved. The plan required split-second timing and absolute trust between man and dog. Amos would create a distraction that drew the guards away from Sarah's prison, while Scout used the ventilation shafts that honeycombed this part of the mine to reach the girl's cell. The dog's intelligence and Sarah's cooperation would be crucial. She had to understand immediately that rescue had arrived and be ready to move when Scout led her to safety. Amos checked his father's rifle one final time, then touched the badge inside his coat for luck. Eleanor's letter crinkled softly against his chest, a paper reminder of the woman who had believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he would not let her down again. The distraction began with a sound that shouldn't have existed in the abandoned mine, the grinding screech of metal on stone echoing from the deepest tunnels. Amos had spent hours rigging an old ore cart to roll down a steep grade, its wheels locked and dragging, creating exactly the kind of noise that would draw armed men away from their posts to investigate. Morrison's reaction was immediate and professional. "Check that out," he ordered 2 of his men. "Could be a cave-in, could be our mountain man getting careless." Either way, I want to know. The guards moved out with military precision, leaving their posts to investigate the disturbance. But Morrison was too experienced to strip his defenses completely. He kept one man at Sarah's door and positioned himself where he could cover the main approaches to the chamber. It was enough. As the guards disappeared into the tunnel system, Scout emerged from a ventilation shaft near Sarah's prison, with the silent grace of a creature born to move unseen. Amos watched through his crack in the wall as the dog approached the heavy wooden door, then began the delicate process of working the latch with his teeth. Sarah must have heard the scratching at her door, because she moved to the opening immediately. Through the keyhole, she would have seen familiar amber eyes, would have recognized the companion who had shared her family's final camping trip and escaped to bring help across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Scout? Her whisper was barely audible, but the joy in her voice carried clearly through the stone chamber. "Scout, is that really you?" The dog's soft whine of recognition was answer enough. Sarah's faith had been justified, her prayers answered by the arrival of the two creatures she'd drawn in her picture, the man and dog who had come to take her home. The door to Sarah's prison swung open with barely a whisper of sound as Scout's patient work with the latch finally succeeded. The girl emerged like a shadow, moving with the careful silence of someone who had learned that noise meant death in this underground hell. Her blue dress was torn and dirty, but her eyes held the same brave light that Amos remembered from Eleanor's gaze. "Uncle Amos?" she whispered, looking around the chamber with hope and terror warring in her young face. "Scout, did you find Uncle Amos?" The dog pressed against her legs, offering what comfort he could while keeping watch for the guards who would return at any moment. Sarah's hands found Scout's head, and for a brief instant, the fear that had sustained her for days seemed to lift. Her faithful companion had kept his promise, had crossed impossible distances to bring help, but the reunion was cut short by the sound of boots echoing through the tunnel system. Morrison's men returning from their investigation of the distraction. They'd found the rigged ore cart, would know now that someone was playing games with them in their own stronghold. The hunt was about to become deadly serious. "This way," Amos whispered, emerging from his hiding place to guide Sarah toward the escape route he'd planned. She looked up at him with Eleanor's eyes, seeing the star pinned inside his coat, recognizing the man from her faithful drawings, even though they'd never met. "You came," she breathed, and the simple faith in those words nearly broke his heart. "Aunt Eleanor said you would." There was no time for explanations, no chance to tell her about Eleanor's letter or the years of guilt that had driven him to these mountains. Morrison's voice was echoing through the chamber now, sharp with anger and suspicion as he realized what had happened. "Perimeter's been breached," he shouted. "Find that girl! Find whoever took her!" The escape route led through a natural chimney that connected the main chamber to the surface. A crack in the mountain carved by water and time, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Amos had found it during his reconnaissance, had realized it offered the only way out that Morrison's men wouldn't be watching, but reaching it meant crossing 30 yards of open ground with no cover, except the shadows cast by mining equipment and support pillars. Sarah was weak from days of imprisonment and fear, barely able to keep up as they moved through the maze of abandoned machinery. Scout ranged ahead, his superior senses alerting them to dangers that human eyes couldn't detect. Twice, the dog's warning stopped them just short of walking into guards who were sweeping the chamber with military precision, searching every hiding place where a girl and her rescuers might take shelter. They were halfway to the chimney when disaster struck. Sarah stumbled over a piece of mining equipment, the metallic clang echoing through the chamber like a church bell. The sound brought immediate response. Shouts of discovery, the crash of boots on stone, the deadly whisper of weapons being readied for use. "There!" Morrison's voice carried deadly certainty. "Southwest corner by the old stamping mill." Amos pushed Sarah toward the chimney entrance, knowing their only chance lay in reaching the surface before Morrison's men could cut them off. But bullets began chipping stone around them, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing through the chamber like thunder. Scout became their salvation. drawing the shooter's attention with a series of diversionary runs that forced Morrison's men to split their fire between multiple targets. The dog's courage was absolute, risking his life again and again to give Sarah the precious seconds she needed to reach safety. "Can you climb?" Amos asked as they reached the chimney entrance. The natural shaft stretched upward into darkness, its walls rough enough to provide handholds, but treacherous for someone exhausted by days of captivity. "I can do it," Sarah replied, with the quiet determination that marked her as Eleanor's blood. "Scout taught me to be brave." The dog went first, his claws finding purchase on stone that would challenge a mountain goat. Sarah followed, moving with the desperate energy of someone who knew that failure meant death for all of them. Amos came last, covering their retreat with his father's rifle, while Morrison's furious shouts echoed from below. Gunfire followed them up the chimney, bullets sparking off stone walls and filling the narrow space with deadly fragments. But the shaft was too narrow for accurate shooting, and soon they were beyond the range of anyone firing from the chamber floor. They emerged into the grey light of dawn to find snow falling on the mountain peaks, winter's promise finally being kept. Sarah collapsed in the clean mountain air, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion, while Scout stood guard with the vigilance of a creature that understood their escape was far from complete. Below them, Morrison's curses echoed from the mine entrance, followed by the sound of men preparing for pursuit. The rescue had succeeded, but now came the hardest part, getting a weak girl and a loyal dog down from this mountain alive while killers with local knowledge hunted them through country that could kill the careless in a dozen different ways. But Amos looked at Sarah's face, saw Eleanor's courage shining in her young eyes, and knew they would make it home. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to fail now. 3 months later, the first spring warmth was melting the last of winter's snow from the meadow behind Amos's cabin. The place looked different now, lived in, cared for, touched by the presence of family where there had been only solitude for so many years. A vegetable garden occupied the sunny spot where Eleanor had always said one should go, and beside it, a small wooden cross marked the grave of Sarah's parents, brought down from the mountain after Morrison and his men had been taken into custody by federal marshals. Sarah knelt beside the garden bed, her hands gentle as she pressed seeds into the dark earth. The seeds had been the final surprise in Eleanor's black satchel, discovered wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the false bottom that none of them had noticed during those desperate days in the tunnels. Wildflower seeds, mostly. The kind that would bloom in mountain meadows and remind anyone who saw them of hope renewed and beauty persisting despite the darkness that sometimes touched the world. "Aunt Eleanor knew," Sarah said softly, not looking up from her work. "She knew you'd need something beautiful to grow when the bad times were over." Amos sat on the porch steps, watching his newfound family with the quiet contentment of a man who had discovered that redemption could come in the most unexpected forms. Scout lay beside him, grey beginning to show around the dog's muzzle, but his amber eyes still bright with intelligence and loyalty. The animal had never left Sarah's side during her recovery, as if he understood that his mission wasn't complete until she was truly safe. The letters had started arriving a week after they'd returned to civilization. Word of Sarah's rescue had spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by the federal marshals who had arrested Morrison's gang, and by the newspaper reporters who never tired of stories about brave dogs and mountain men who'd risked everything to save an innocent child. The first letter came from Sarah's teacher back in Pine Ridge, expressing gratitude that Eleanor's niece had been found alive. Then came letters from other families who had lost loved ones to Morrison's gang, thanking Amos for bringing justice to men who had thought themselves beyond the reach of the law. The territorial governor had written personally, offering Amos his old job back with a promotion and a commendation for distinguished service. But it was the letter from Sarah's maternal grandmother that had meant the most, the one that Scout had carried in his mouth when he brought the mail up from the valley. The old woman, too frail to travel but fierce in her gratitude, had written pages about how proud she was of her granddaughter's courage and how thankful she was to the man who had brought her home safely. "You're not just Uncle Amos anymore," she had written. "Your family now, truly and forever. Eleanor chose well when she trusted you with our most precious treasure." Scout's ears perked up as the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the trail below. Visitors were still a rarity at the mountain cabin, but they came more frequently now. Friends from town checking on Sarah's recovery, federal agents finalizing their case against Morrison's gang, and occasionally families seeking help with missing loved ones who had heard about the hermit who had returned to the world of the living. This time, it was Dr. Matthews from Pine Ridge, making his weekly visit to check on Sarah's health and to share the news from the valley below. The elderly physician had become a regular fixture at the cabin, drawn as much by the remarkable story of the rescue as by his professional duties. "How is our patient today?" he asked, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many years in the saddle. "Strong," Amos replied, and it was true. The frail girl who had emerged from the mine tunnels 3 months ago had grown sturdy and confident under the mountain sun, her cheeks pink with health and her eyes bright with the kind of happiness that came from knowing she was loved and safe. "And you?" Dr. Matthews asked, studying Amos with the shrewd gaze of someone who understood that healing came in many forms. "Any regrets about giving up the hermit life?" Amos looked out over the meadow, where Sarah was planting Eleanor's seeds, where Scout was teaching a litter of puppies the patience and loyalty that had saved them all, where the future was taking root in soil that had known only solitude for too long. "None," he said simply. That evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them sat on the porch and watched the day fade into peaceful twilight. Sarah had insisted on reading aloud from her new journal, sharing the story of their adventure as she'd written it down for posterity. "Scout was the bravest dog in the whole world," she read, "and Uncle Amos was the best sheriff who ever lived. And together they saved me from the bad men who hurt Mama and Papa. But the most important thing is that we're a family now. And families stick together no matter what." Scout's tail thumped against the porch boards, and Amos felt Eleanor's presence in the evening breeze that stirred the wildflowers they'd planted in her memory. She had given him more than just a second chance. She had given him a future worth living, a family worth protecting, and the knowledge that love could survive even death when it was strong enough and true enough. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah fell asleep against Amos's shoulder, while Scout kept his eternal watch over them both. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called its ancient song to the mountains, and in the garden beside the cabin, Eleanor's seeds dreamed of the flowers they would become when spring returned to the high country. The black satchel that had started it all sat on the mantelpiece inside, empty now but treasured as the vessel that had carried hope across impossible distances and brought healing to hearts that had forgotten how to trust in tomorrow, sometimes the most unlikely. Heroes really do find us when we need them most, and sometimes salvation really does come on 4 paws, carrying love in a worn leather bag that holds everything necessary to make a family whole again.